In today's video, we look around another people's palace, a prefab at St Fagans in Cardiff, and I'm also going to share some of your own memories of prefab living. Hello, welcome to Through Lucy's Lens, weekly videos where I go somewhere interesting and hopefully you will find them interesting too. I'm at St Fagans Museum in Wales, right near Cardiff, the capital of Wales, and you have been telling me about the prefab here, and I'm just obsessed with prefabs. I can't help it. So I've come here to see the prefab, and when I arrived, it said it was closed, and I was very, very upset. But it turns out when I went to film it, it was actually open. And what I'm going to do is, in the first video I made about prefabs, hundreds of you shared your memories of prefab living in the comments. So during this video, I'm going to be reading out some of those comments about the memories of living in a prefab, while also telling you about the prefab here at St Fagans. So shall we go and do it? Let's go. The prefab at St Fagans originally stood in Llandinium Crescent in Cardiff, which is a few miles north of Cardiff city centre. It was built there in 1948 and was dismantled and rebuilt at St Fagans in 1998. It's an AIROH B2 model. There are around 56,000 AIROH prefabs built in the United Kingdom to provide housing after World War II. AIROH stands for Aircraft Industries Research Organisation on Housing, and it represented 13 British aviation firms to develop and implement plans to sustain the aircraft industry's production capabilities through an expected post-war economic downturn. Morrison's Engineering Company and architects A.F. Hare designed this bungalow made from aluminium, and the houses were made using salvaged and scrapped metal from World War II aircraft. As an aviation enthusiast, I love this fact about this particular model of prefab. AIROH houses were manufactured by 4 aircraft firms: Bristol Aeroplane Company in Weston-super-Mare, 2 Vickers Armstrong factories in both Chester and Blackpool, the Blackburn Aircraft Company's factory at Dumbarton, and A.W. Hawksley's factory in Gloucester. The prefab at St Fagans was built in Gloucester. Because the construction of a prefab was less complicated than an aircraft, the factories were able to achieve a high output quickly, producing up to 200 houses per day. Each AIROH house section was delivered by truck to a pre-prepared site in 4 sections. A crane lifted the sections into position, and the assembly crew bolted the sections together to form the completed house. After that, utilities including water, electricity and sewer services were connected. In May 1945, there was a demonstration of the AIROH house being erected on London's Oxford Street, and they achieved the full completion in just 4 hours. The prefabs arrived on site fully equipped and provided 675 square feet of living space. This included an entry hall, a living room with fireplace, a master bedroom, a smaller second bedroom, but each had inbuilt wardrobes. There was a fully equipped and modern kitchen with refrigerator, gas or electric cooker, and a copper to use as a washing machine. The full bathroom had a bath, toilet and sink. The kitchen and bathroom were placed back to back to simplify plumbing and electrical installation. All new tenants had to do in these prefabs was turn up, bring their belongings and start living their lives. The prefab at St Fagans is decorated as it would have been in around 1955. As we tour the house, I'd like to share some of the comments I received about prefab living in my previous video about another prefab. Your comments bring history to life and will remain as a verbal record of living working class history. This is a very special thing indeed. I'm going to provide all kinds of viewpoints to avoid those rose-tinted spectacles, but please enjoy. I was born in a prefab in Bristol in 1948. It's not there anymore, but my cousin still lives in one. They were wonderful. My mum was heartbroken when she had to move. They had a washing machine, fridge. I lived there until I was 7. Fond memories. I grew up in a prefab in the northwest. While it was home, it was absolutely freezing in winter. When I was going to school and college, I used to get dressed in my clothes and go to bed in them, so I didn't have to get dressed in the morning as it was so cold. Even electric blankets couldn't really help. The walls were so thin. I used to wake up to ice inside of my windows. The council installed central heating at some point, but it never really worked properly. We had to use fan heaters, electric fires and a Cala gas heater. I was so jealous of school friends who had normal brick houses that were nice and warm. Maybe some models were warmer than others, but all I remember is the cold. Prefabs bring back so many good memories of my nan and granddad's prefab in Tile Cross in Birmingham. I stayed there in the 1960s with them many times and I was so happy. The prefab even had a gas-powered fridge. I know it sounds impossible, but true. I often wish I could go back in time and live those days again. We lived in a prefab for about 8 years in the 1950s, 60s. We had a big fitted kitchen with lots of storage and built-in fridge, cooker and a good bathroom. Also, the bedrooms had lots of built-in storage, plus there was a big hall cupboard. We had quite big gardens at the front and back and grew veg there as well as flowers. It wasn't damp, we never had mould or anything like that. I lived in a prefab from the age of 5 to 15 years. All the internal walls and cupboards were metal and it was absolutely freezing in winter. The window frames were metal too. It was so cold that one winter the S-bend of the toilet froze and cracked open, and my brother and I got whacked for peeing on the toilet floor until the problem was found. The living room fire sent heat straight up the chimney, not into the room, but it was home and I was sad to leave it. This was in Essex. I used to visit my nan when I was a small child with my mother. She lived in a prefab in Orpington, Kent. I remember it being warm, snug and cosy. This would have been in the 1960s. I'd live in one given the chance. They should build more of them now as affordable housing. My nan used to live in one of these prefabs in New Oscott, Birmingham, until around 1978. Then they were demolished for more modern housing developments. I had great times there as a kid on the summer holidays and weekends. It was spacious and cosy when the log fire was on. Wonderful memories of those times, and it's a pity that they're gone because they had so much character. I was raised up in a prefab. Thank you for bringing back such wonderful memories. Times were hard, but we had lots of love. I lived in a prefab. It was concrete sections bolted together and a tin roof, but some of them were completely tin locally. It was bloody cold in the winter. I had a school friend who lived in a prefab. He used to say he didn't have a spare key, just a can opener. I remember it had a built-in ironing board and a radio aerial on the roof, along with loads of storage cupboards. Outside they still had an Anderson shelter that was used for storage. It was great. You could just move in and live your life. I was little in the 1960s and we lived in a prefab in Lancashire. There used to be ice on the windows inside in the winter. We had to use paraffin heaters to keep warm. I ended up with pneumonia and nearly died. There was 3 children and my mum and dad in this small space. They were happy days, but hard times. I was born in a prefab in Shady Lane, Birmingham. It was really lovely inside, painted cream and a real dream after the back-to-backs we left in downtown Brum. The place was warm and I can only recall flashbacks, but I don't remember anything bad. We lived in a prefab in London for 14 years. It was all mod cons, even a fridge that nobody else had. A coal fire, hot water, but it was single glaze with ice inside the windows. All in all though, happy days. I lived in a prefab in the 1960s. Cold drafts in winter and boiling hot in summer. One thing I remember is that it came with a fridge. This was a great luxury in those days. I was born in the 1960s and grew up in the 1970s. The first freezer I ever encountered was in my nan's prefab. This was in Newport, South Wales. I remember an aunt and uncle living in a prefab. They were rehoused in a tower block, which drove my aunt half crazy. She really didn't want to leave her prefab. I still remember as a kid wandering round the empty prefabs as they were getting ready to be demolished. I lived in a prefab in Beckton, East London in the 1960s. We moved out in 1969 as the council said they were demolishing them, but they ended up being there until the mid-70s. Our little estate was a great place to grow up. We were surrounded by open ground and trees, and it didn't seem like London at all. I'm 77 this year, and for the first 16 years of my life I lived in a prefab. Not to be recommended by today's standards, but back then it was perfectly acceptable. There was a fitted kitchen with gas fridge, 2 bedrooms and an open fire, and a big garden back and front. The rent collector made sure you kept the gardens and the hedges tidy. It was a nice place to grow up. Me and my 2 siblings were born in one in London after my family had been bombed out during World War II. They were lovely and we lived happily for several years until the council pulled them down and we were put in a tower block. Prefabs were only meant to be lived in for 10 to 15 years. However, many of them still remain today. There's an estimate of between 1 to 2,000, and some of them don't even look like prefabs anymore. They've been refurbished and reclad, and they're indistinguishable from traditional bungalows. I'd love to hear from you if you still lived in one. I hope you enjoyed today's video, something a little different, and it's really nice to involve you all in this process. There is another video coming next week about St Fagans. I was going to put 2 types of houses together, but I felt like they needed their own space to shine. Please do subscribe if you enjoy my content. It really does help me. And until next week, goodbye.